adolescent ages, you suffer all kinds of troubles psychologically, whether it's friends, whether it's families, whether it's the pressure to keep on studying and all that kind of things. But we think that any problem that happens to your own body is best solved when you have autonomy over it, because we certainly don't think that your body belongs to the parents or somebody else, and you minors should be able to approach the professional care if necessary, and that's why we propose today that minors should be able to be prescribed with medicines without parental consent. So what do we propose in this debate? Firstly, we think that minors can go through the usual procedures of being prescribed medicines. For example, it's probably going to be the same with all cases of adults being prescribed or kids being prescribed with these pills under the supervision of parents. That is to say, for example, it's going to be done by professional medical professionals. They're probably going to take usual procedures, like, for example, observing the kids and counseling the kids for like the last 3 months, examining what the kid says and whether that is actually applies to the medical criteria, or whether somebody has having some kind of psychiatric problems and all that kind of things. One difference here, though, is that you don't necessarily note it down, require parental consent. That is to say that there is not going to be any reporting to the parents and all that kind of things. A kid can come alone, and this kid can get prescription. Even if they come to the parents and parents refuse to get the pills, the kids can agree to it and get the pills and that kind of things. We also think that there's going to be a lot of more information provided to the kids on where to access when you need help. It's going to be done through schools, in classes, in PE classes maybe, that you can go to whichever places and get your help. You have to go through these procedures, but you can do it if you want. If money is a problem for the minors also, we think that state should provide some support into it. I think this is clear, but if you have any, I'll take one now.
Taken.
Will you allow children to go through surgery without parental consent?
Firstly, we think that's a different debate. But secondly, we think that we can prove that it is the same as a psychiatric problem. We think that's something we are absolutely happy to do with, because you own your body to a certain extent. Now, 3 things to talk about from the first speaker. Firstly, why kids now, some of the kids can't go to psychiatrists and get the pills. Secondly, benefit of saving your own body. But lastly, why we think that legal framework is better than random prescription of pills on the internet or from friends and all that kind of things. Firstly, in terms of some kids not being able to get the prescription, simply when it is a legal requirement that parents are accompanying you, and legal requirement that parents need to agree that the kids gets a prescription, it causes a number of problems in the process of kids getting the pill. Firstly, for example, if the parents are from like relatively older generation, they may have a bad image towards psychological disorders in many ways. For example, they used to live along in the neighborhood a kid with like some level of psychological disorders. He was violent. He was very doing some silly things, for example, because he was a little bit immature compared to other people. That is accompanied maybe by the phase of madness, and that may recall. Also, another reason may be that it is actually the parents and the relationship with the parents that you spend like 8 hours a day together that is causing all these mental problems that is happening to the kids. In this situation, ladies and gentlemen, we think it is very difficult, first of all, for the kids to ask the parents for company in the first place, because they may feel like they're going to be rejected. Secondly, you don't even ask for parents for company because you feel that you're going to be disappointing your parents. My parents may call you as little mad kids, and the parents and the kids may not like that. Thirdly, we tell you that even if you can't go to, if you do come to the psychiatrist with the company of the parents, at the point that the doctor says that this kid needs to be prescribed with these kind of medicines, the parents may reject that because the parents are a different being to you. They don't really necessarily understand the real kind of harm that is going on to you. They may refuse that for that reason. But lastly, we think that kids can't go to psychiatrists themselves because they may fear that the doctor may call your parents after you all write down all your names or your addresses, phone numbers, so that the doctor may contact you if necessary. That may also go back to the parents, and that destroys your relationship with the parents and yourself. Last, what are the benefits of what people being prescribed with doctors? Firstly, at the point they can't come to the council, better that you do get counseling to a certain extent, because we think that most of the problems of adolescent psychological anxiety happens because of whatever, like things like friendly relationships, what happens in school, and all that kind of things. You may be able to get counseling and that may be able to enoughly solve you out of that situation. But secondly, if you get the pills, and you might get saved. If you have, for example, a depression, literally that may lead to you harming yourself and killing yourself and all that kind of things. But secondly, if you have ADHD and things, again, your inability to study may destroy your future entirely. Why do we think that kids should be able to consent to this? Because simply it's your own body, even if you are young. It's your body that you have invested in, you have utilized over, and all that kind of thing. But secondly, we say that especially parents are not necessarily the best arbiter in deciding what you can consent, especially in this case. Especially in this case, we think that the parent is a different person, with different experiences of childhood, because what happens in school right now is maybe very different from what happened in school 30 years ago. Secondly, we think the harms are very, very, very invisible. It's not necessarily like your legs or arms swelling or turning red. It's not about you vomiting all over the place. It's about what happens in your mind, and that is simply invisible for the parents. Who knows the best about it is simply yourself. We don't necessarily think that the age of consent is an absolute criteria. We don't necessarily think that at the point you turn 18, it makes you able to consent. Especially when you think that 17 years old and 364 days old is about the same as 18. That's absolutely arbitrary. When it is arbitrary, we think it is much better that you as an individual, it takes control over your body, especially when it comes to serious harms like injury, like killing yourself. It's important rights that you have to obtain. We're talking about life, we're talking about future of the kids. It is very important. Lastly, about the legal framework. What happens that when these kids can't get a legal prescription is that they go to the internet and buy it from random websites or get it from random friends. Well, firstly, we don't necessarily know what's in that. So that may lead to poisoning you, killing you, having other different disorders in terms of gut, in terms of your digestion, and all that kind of things, which may also ruin your life. But secondly, it may not even work. So you have a prolonged phase of being suffering from their mental disorders, and that is bad. We think it's simply better to get legal care from the legal specially trained, accountable doctors we beg to propose.
Thank you, Chair. I think the biggest problem coming from Prime Minister's case was how they failed in portraying a realistic model and a realistic image of how children are going to act and how parents are in the current status quo. We find it pretty unrealistic that in the vast majority of instances, parents don't care so much about their children. The parents are trying to actively give the children mentally disorders that they don't care about their children. We also think it's pretty unrealistic to say that children, whenever are just going to go to harmful websites, go to the darknet and buy drugs. I don't think that's a very realistic case, and I'm going to provide you a much better realistic and a more rational case coming from opposition. 3 things. First, in terms of model, 4 parts. We've said first that on our side, we're very happy to enhance education of medical diseases and how to find potential symptoms of children for parents. That's why we think it's very easily on opposition. So even if government has certain concerns about what's going to happen to children if parents don't know, we're happy to take care of that through assertive medical knowledge. Second, we're also very happy to fund counseling systems. So if children find it hard to discuss with parents, we're very happy for them to go to counseling systems and have another adult whenever it comes to the discussion of mental disorders for psychiatrists. Third, we're very happy to also include doctors. That's to say that in the case of actual diseases like ADHD, like Proposition said, we're very happy to them to provide medical knowledge to doctors. Fourthly, we think in the vast majority, any kind of negligence or any kind of actual harm that is occurring to children, we're very happy to prosecute it. So any kind of case that comes from Proposition upon that is not going to be taken. Couple of rebuttals before I begin my constructive speeches, and other rebuttals will be integrated. The first thing, basically what they talked about was that children can't get prescriptions for a couple of reasons. But I find that the logic there was pretty problematic. That's to say that the first thing they came up here and said was that they have that parents are going to have a bad image of disorders. If that's the case, then I would say that's exactly the reason why parents would have a huge incentive to try to fix it with their children. If they have a bad image, I think they would want their children to make sure that they could get rid of that bad image, that they want their children to be healthy and happy. And I think that's a better reason as to why parents should be involved, because they could actively encourage their children to make actual changes. The second is that they talked about the instances where it's the parent's fault. But you say that if it is the parent's fault, that's exactly the reason why you should include them in the equation. That's to say that for symbiosis to act in the first place, then parents are gonna keep on doing the same thing that caused those kind of disorders in the first place because they don't know about it if they not thought about it in the first place. So in those instances, I would say it's a pretty realistic case coming from opposition to say that nothing's gonna really change because parents are not gonna know and parents are not going to do anything in order to help the children on proposition. Other rebuttals will be integrated upon my speech, but upon the characterization, I didn't really understand it. The first argument coming from them is in terms of irrational decision, how that's going to be encouraged on proposition. 3 parts. First is in terms that children are lacking knowledge and expertise, and they don't have the mentality to be able to process and access, to understand the kind of medical and technical knowledge that these doctors are going to provide in the first place. The only principle the Prime Minister came up here and talked to us that, hey, that you have your own body, so you should be able to control it. If that's the case, then I think on proposition, they're going to be supporting children doing alcohol and tobacco because it's your body, right? The thing is that the principle that should be taken is considering what's best for the children's body. And I think both sides in this debate need to prove which side is going to do better things for children's body, not that this weird principle of you should be able to do whatever with your body, because that's not realistically true. Given that, we would say that the first logic analysis coming here is that children usually are we're happy to take this case that children usually are embarrassed to reveal their parents, and that's an incentive to go. But the problem here is that it's too dangerous. That's to say children don't know the side effects, that I think they're too still inexperienced to know about any kind of allergies they hold or any kind of past bad experiences with certain types of technology like MRI. In those instances, it's only those parents who know. So as long as there's no parental consent, we think there's still effects and potential of side effects, potentially giving heart attacks to children because of allergy risks. No thanks. But second, so what's likely to happen is the children are likely to emotionally appeal to these doctors in the first place, which means that either these prescriptions through preserve incentives to provide and gain money from children, or from a sense of guilt, I think their doctors are likely to give medicine without really knowing what's going on with these children. At those points, we think it's pretty realistically contextually true to say that children are not sufficiently aware of the kind of situation they're in, and you need parents. This is harmful for a couple of reasons. First, it's to say that addiction is very likely to occur. That's to say, I think there's many instances where children die from addiction, from tranquilization and heart attacks because they didn't possess the correct information on how to do it. We think parents need to be able to know if their children has the potential of being addicted on something in order for them to monitor them in their private environment.
Taken.
Amount of prescription is controlled not by individual children but by doctors. Why suddenly that overdose is happening and why suddenly addiction happens? If it is happening in our world, it happens in your world as well.
No, it's not going to happen because the responsibility isn't going to be on doctors on their side, given the fact that they could just say that the children just misuse any kind of thing, because apparently if parental consent isn't there, then the doctors can just get away with lawsuits in the vast majority of instances because they have more knowledge, more financial resources than them. But I think the biggest harm that's going to happen is the proper curing process is going to be deferred. That's to say that in the case of mental disorders, it's not just a problem of taking medicine. It requires a lot of background support in private environments. That's to say things like what time you're going to sleep, what things you eat for balance, vitamin balance. And the potential, and the thing is that if you don't have parental consent, then parents aren't going to be able to help you in these kind of instances. They won't be able to support the system. And we think in those instances, these kind of procedures are going to be prolonged. Thirdly, we say in terms of manipulation, we say there's still going to be instances where therapists can easily slip into the vulnerable minds of maybe little girls or little boys and do things that are too pretty scary for them to happen behind closed doors. Fourthly, we think that means that children are now going to have incentives to not to communicate with their parents because they're going to be too scared. That means that whenever there's still potential heart attacks or abnormality with their body, children still are not going to tell their parents about it. We think this is urgent in the case of fixing urgent issues and heart attacks. The reason why parental rights are so important in the vast majority of instances is because parents care about their children. That's to say, I think it's important to have a second opinion where parents are able to effectively monitor, where parents are more knowledgeable and they're the only ones that know about the side effects and the environments that these children are going to. Because of this unique positioning of parental rights, that's a reason why they have absolute control over their children, where they know all the issue of a medical reports. And that's the reason why we think that parents have to be the ones to give consent in order for the children's body to be safe and protect these vulnerable bodies from any kind of danger. That's why I'm so happy to post.
I think you need to recognize that stigma and social perception towards mental health issues are terrifying barriers for children to access the help that they need. When you're already stressed out and feeling anxiety and depression as a result of your parents being problematic, we think it is impossible for you to get help outside opposition's paradigm. Firstly, brief refutations and then 2 constructive materials. So, basically 2 lines of refutation. First, we think the counter model coming from side opposition is not mutually exclusive, right? We will give parents education on our side of the house as well. We think that is totally possible. But secondly, we tell you, if parents are good enough as they explain and describe on their side of the house, we think the vast majority of children will go to the parents anyways in our side as well. They probably have a closer connection and emotional tie with them if they are as opposition characterized. Therefore, we think the most significant portion of the actors in this debate are those who do not want to notify their parents but still feel that they need psychological help. That being said, moving on to our constructive materials. Firstly, I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give you a more nuanced analysis of problematic relationships with parents with children that struggle with their mental health. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what happens when kids don't have access to professional help and why that world is much darker on side opposition. Firstly, 3 levels of analysis. For many children, parents are not accessible resource for help, right? And for some, there are direct or indirect causes that led to issues with mental health to begin with. So I'm going to give you 3 case studies to show some examples of what the world for these kind of children looks like. We think one of the most common disorders or mental health issues that a lot of young people face is, for example, obese eating disorder, right? We think body shaming embedded in some cultures like in Japan and in Korea leads to a lot of young people in their growing and developmental stages to have insecurities with their bodies and have problematic relationship with foods, things like binging disorders or purging or anorexia, etc., etc. Recognize that awareness of body positivity and its relation to mental health is only now increasing among young people and still foreign to many parents or people around that age. Oftentimes, the case when we are triggered the most is by comments by our parents or relatives in relation to our size. When we are growing in our developmental stages, being told that we should lose weight because we are too chubby can lead to things like can potentially lead to mental health issues that need medical attention. What is important to note here is one of the key reasons your parents make these comments are because they think it is normal and they rather genuinely believe that they are giving good advice and are likely, therefore, to become extremely defensive to the idea that they were doing something that was actually harming their child. This means that 1, it is difficult for the child to defy the cultural norms and consult the parents when they are actually need help. And 2, if they are forced to share with their parents, their relationship with parents are likely to become worse because the parents are likely to be upset and want to deny the fact that they are the cause of the emotional mental health issues of their children. The second case is for things like depression and anxiety, which is also very common amongst young people now. We think that it is oftentimes triggered by high demanding parents or things like emotional abuse, etc., where the child does not have a healthy relationship with their parents to begin with. Obviously, in this case, it is almost impossible for them to go to their parents to ask for medical help and attention. We think it is impossible for opposition to deal with their case. But the second type of those things that lead to depression or anxiety is things like struggling with your sexual identity or gender identity, etc. too, right? You think that being gay or trans in a family whose religious beliefs are not accommodating of your identity can oftentimes lead to struggles that it is almost impossible for you to share because your parents would tell you that you might go to hell, or at least you perceive that your parents might react in that way. We also think that there's other issues that you're just ashamed of or don't want to share, right? You may be ashamed of the fact that you may have ADHD or PTSD from an experience that you do not want to share with your parents because it is very private, right? The important nuances is unable to be combated by opposition's counter model of education because it oftentimes the perception of the child and their inability to feel safe with sharing this information. So regardless of how good of an intention the parents have, it is not going to lead to accessibility to professional help. Yeah.
Taken.
Okay. These cases like ADHD, depression, or eating disorders can only be fixed through things like proper sleep procedures, meal balances, healthy environments, which are all things only parents can monitor. What's your method of fixing these diseases without parental backup?
Okay, so obviously you need to be comparative, right? And outside of the house, the parents aren't going to be able to give their children those advices because they're not going to be consulted by children to begin with. At least in outside of the house, psychiatric professionals can give them the medical help that they need, so medicines. They can also give them realistic advice given the circumstances of the familial structure that they are in. Therefore, as a comparative, at least in our side of the house, we get comparatively more help and better medical attention in comparison to none at all. This is important because the impacts of these diseases like eating disorder, depression, etc. can lead to extremely dangerous outcomes. Things like suicidal thoughts, attempted or even completing suicide, for example, is a very real danger and a risk that opposition needs to engage with. Right? The second constructive is going to be on what happens when kids don't have access to professional help. PM talked about how the black market exists, things like internet or even sharing Xanax with your friends who have anxiety is something that is very common. It is dangerous because it is not prescribed by a professional. You cannot go to your parents or the police if you're endangered, specifically because you have engaged in an illegal transaction of drugs, etc. But secondly, we tell you that acts of self-harm is very common as a coping mechanism when there's nowhere else to go. At least in our side of the house, things like addiction to unhealthy ways of dealing with trauma and mental health can be mitigated or guided into a healthy direction by a professional. This doesn't happen unless accessibility exists. At the end of the day, at least we get more kids psychological help. This motion saves lives, and even if we bite all the bullets coming from side opposition, we still take this debate.
This is one piece of crucial framing which is untouched by the side proposition in this debate, which is that you spend a lot of time at home, you eat dinner every day, and the kind of like lifestyle that you have is entirely contingent on what your parents want you to lead to, right? So the point is that for the efficacy of their prescription to actually exist, you actually need a parental consent. You need an understanding of parents to actually not prolong the recovery procedure. Because if it is a case that parents do not know about the psychological harm that you have been incurred, and that the parents are the reason why, as the proposition characterizes, are the fundamental reason and that reason why these psychological harm has been experienced by that child, then it becomes the case that the point at which parents do not change any kind of behaviors, this harm would continue. So I think this framing, already takes us today. I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, I want to talk about parental rights, and secondly, I want to talk about why the misuse of prescription is necessarily or almost all the time is something that happens on that side of the house. But before moving on to that, a couple of extraneous rebuttals, right? Firstly, I just want to note about the context in the debate. Recognize that the argument we get from the side proposition, especially the PM's material, is heavily contingent on the minor context in this debate. Recognize the majority of parents care about this. Now, Maria-san tries to frame this out by saying, one, that the stigma towards psychological harm exists, but recognize the fact that this is why we are setting the model of counseling, for example, and also doctors, after doctors talking to parents directly about the kind of psychological states in which your child is. Recognize that oftentimes these vast majority of parents do genuinely believe in what your doctor or what your counselors in school tells you to do. Oftentimes these individuals do hear and listen to the opinions, professional opinions of these individuals to be more and more understanding towards the issue. Then secondly, Maria-san says that lots of children would go to parents on that side of the house anyway. I think that just means that they're significantly mitigating their own impact on that side of the house. But recognize secondly, yes, I recognize that there is a fair amount of psychological barrier when it comes to children voicing out to parents that I have a psychological disease. But it's not sufficient to the extent that it prevents me from actually not getting any sort of access to these medical professions on our side of the house. So when So you're likely, the vast majority of children are likely to go through parents and talk about this issue, and then go to doctors. So that's a comparative. So yeah, firstly, let's talk about parental rights. I want to note three things. Firstly, that parents have far more capacity to be able to understand what exactly is going on to your body for two reasons. One is the experience that they have. I think this is there's a weird mischaracterizing we get from PM, which is that like the age is different, therefore there's kind of experiential gap. Recognize that those parents themselves have went through puberty, have went through teenage life, and presumably have lots of things going on in their psychology. So they do presumably understand lots of things, lots of psychological issues that the teenagers usually have. Secondly, recognize that the knowledge of how your past 15 years of medical history looked like is exclusively available to your parents. So I think this is a really crucial thing. The second thing to recognize is that there's a maximum incentive on the side of parents to actually care about the interests of children, as Maria-san have already considered to. Thirdly, we think that when it comes to moral decision, when it comes to medical decision, given that it requires a moral judgment, we think that we fundamentally require the consent from parents. And the reason is really simple. In the same way we allow parents to determine what the religious belief of their child looks like, we think that children are in the process of formation of morality, and they're not completely being formed. And recognize that's why parents, as the most proximate actor, which understands the preferences of these children and can be the most legitimate proxy of that decision, we think ought to be the one to determine that decision. Okay. Secondly, let's talk about how the misuse of prescription is something that's really, really likely to happen. Who will move on?
Taken.
If you think parental authority is such supreme value, why do your partner from LO allow children to go to counseling without parental consent?
So, I mean, obviously it's difficult. It's sometimes for some children, it may be emotionally difficult to tell your parents directly to your face. So that's why you actually use the mechanism of, counseling and counselors as a way to actually sort of cushion the effect, right? So that's that. Okay. So second argument then. I want you to recognize that four observations that I made. Firstly, recognize the lack of information that I've alluded to and Sena have talked about already, and also the fact that some doctors are just not good people. That recognize that there are lots of reported cases where psychiatrists actively sexually harass young girls, teenage girls, who have psychological disorders. So, not necessary. So maybe those psychiatrists may take advantage because there's a plausible reason to believe that there is an incentive on the side of psychiatrists to do this because of the profit incentive, right? So I guess that's that. Second observation that I make is that children become more isolated at home. Recognize the fact that they constantly try to hide the existence of this pill and prescription from parents means that you're going to start to see parents as a threat who may potentially take away the thing, that prescription that allows you to have a healthy life away from you. So you're going to feel in your head that your parents are actually the enemies of you, not necessarily supporting you. So this kind of mindset is going to be exacerbated on your side, on that side of the house, and you cannot therefore have discourse on that side of the house, but we can on our side. Recognize that parents are oftentimes understanding and try to actually not emotionally harm these children in the vast majority of circumstances. Thirdly, recognize that the children, when they take tranquilizer, obviously you feel good about it. You obviously feel more emotionally stable. And this feeling is the gateway to the addiction in the majority of cases. Recognize that children oftentimes do not understand the importance of following the prescription that doctor tells you to do. So oftentimes you take 2 pills, even if the doctor says only 1 pill per day. So that means that the overdose is something that is really, really likely, but with parents' oversight, given that they know for sure that, following the prescription from doctor is something that is crucial for medical, for your health, I think that the comparative is that far less use of overdose. Fourthly, recognize that some cases, in some instances, there are instances in which children are going to be found out about the pill, about the fact that they have been secretly going to that doctor. In that circumstance, parents are likely to be more dismissive to the idea of psychological harm that you have been, incurred by your parents, for example. Recognize that, you're probably parents are going to probably mad at you for hiding, or mad at doctors in general for not telling them about it, for example. So for all these reasons, we need to be comparative in this debate.
To prove why we are already winning in this debate. First, they misunderstand the motion. This motion is not
This helps to force children to ignore parental consent when they go to a psychiatrist. What we told you about parent-children relationship is that maybe it's true that vast majority of children rely on parents before they go to hospitals. Those people are not the target of this debate. Because unless opposition proves this motion will be the easy incentive shortcut for children to ignore parental consent before going to hospitals, still those people are consulting to parents anyway. The target of our survey house is that children who cannot consult with parents due to parental bullying other precise reasons why they are being depressed. They just said our benefit is minuscule without telling why. We are not carrying the number of children, we are carrying the quality of harm, psychological harm children are getting. In that sense, that isolation argument coming from DLO is completely not exclusive because that is already happening in the household in the current context. Second framing. What we told you from that out of the house is that two extremely irrational children who ignore doctor's advice in terms of overdosing, for example, are currently accessing illegal internet market to access to illegal drugs, or either they are accessing non-certified random drugs which monetizes social influencers are producing and promoting on Instagram, for example. Then anyway, those irrational children are not the exclusive actor in this debate. In any way, opposition are quite dismissive to engage our core characterizations. That's why we are already winning in this debate. To further, I will go into three issues. First, about the parental right and authority, why this doesn't make any sense. Secondly, about parents and the environment should be changed, which is main argument coming from opposition bench, why this is not also exclusive. Lastly, about children's irrational, even if some about children's irrationality and illegal market we told you. First, about parental authority. First to note is that there was only limited shallow analysis coming from opposition bench saying that parents are caring children, that's why they should have authority to children. Two responses. Firstly, those characters are not likely to be applied in this case. We told you that those parents, the reason why children feel difficulty in consulting towards parents is that they think parents are not caring those children. Parents are not understanding their children well. That's why they have a massive difficulty to consult with parents before psychiatrists. That's why their premise doesn't apply to this debate. Secondly, as I pointed out to DLO, they are okay with going to counselors without parental consent. And counseling is one form of procedure in medications and curing certain disorders, which means they had BOP to distinguish why counseling and medicine is such different thing, which they haven't done until DLO. I think opposition will be too late. Second analysis coming from opposition bench is about rationality. Firstly, what opposition should have proven is not parents are better actors than children, but why parents are better actors than doctors. Because even in our world, those children anyway have to consult with doctors for 3 months, for example. It is already mandatory requirement even to the adults, for example. Then to that, opposition haven't proven. Second response, they just throw analogy of tobacco and alcohol. It's just example. There was no reason and logic to support those analogies. And also it's quite different thing. We saw it from Prime Minister that the thing in this debate is about subjectivity, which parents have never experienced and can never have epistemic access to the feelings of the children. That's why it's quite a different thing because tobacco and alcohol obviously have immense physical harm in terms of body development, for example. Lastly, in terms of experiences and understanding, including moral value, which DLO asserted because the bottleneck of moral argument was about understanding preference for children. Those parents, even though they experience teenagers, they haven't experienced internet bullying. And also their teenage was surrounded full of masculinity and their cultures were not welcoming diversities, then they just said you have to endure tormentful things that suffering makes you stronger. Those cultures are quite different from what is going on in the current era, which means those parents' experiences are quite different from children especially in this case. That's why their premise about principle doesn't stand. Secondly, about parents and environment should be changed to completely solve those problems. First to note, we already proved that at least our side is better. Because their assumption is that in the opposition paradigm, all children will go to hospital with parental consent. It's obviously not true. We told you that those children cannot consult the parents. They completely ignored until DLO. I think it's quite dismissive and it's too late for opposition to deal with as well. Which means what happened in opposition world is not those parents are re-educated to care children, but the children just hold those problems within their own mind because they cannot consult the parents, then those problems just go to exacerbated, including isolation problem, which means all problems go worse in opposition world. And even if this motion unnecessarily incentivizes children to go to hospital without consulting the parents, which they haven't explained until DLO, I have two responses to further. First of all, as we pointed out, LO's model is not mutually exclusive, which means we can magically change parents' attitudes whether or not children go to hospital with parents, like parental consent or not. Because according to LO's magical model, they educate parents in terms of education. Maybe in the process of pregnancy, maybe the parents have provided education about the psychological situation of children. Then maybe this medical education can solve anything according to LO, which is not exclusive to outside the house at all. Second response, at least even without parental consent, the half of their lifestyle can be changed without parental support, which is school life. If children home, even in our world, without reporting to parents, those psychiatrists can report to schools. They can provide sufficient background help in terms of in terms of diet, in terms of lifestyle. For example, those children can be allowed to skip certain unnecessary classes in order to have enough sleep, for example. Then even without parental consent, sufficiently those background can be changed, which means at least comparatively outside is better. Lastly, children's rationality. We already told you that doctors can rationalize, and I wasn't sure why those doctors are such stupid actors to be emotionally swayed by children's emotional teachings. Obviously, if those doctors don't follow the legal guidelines to prescribe medicines, they are prosecuted. And according to LO's model, prosecution works well, which means DLO's argument about sexual harassment to children also doesn't work because according to LO's model, prosecution works well. And even if some irrational children does exist, we already told you from Deputy Prime Minister, illegal market is worse because they cannot access to the legal help. They might hesitate to consult to doctors or teachers or policies, and also that those quality of medicines are much worse in those illegal markets, which was completely neglected until so far. Which means for all aspects outside, it's better. Thank you.
2 points of clarification. Number one, this debate is about prescription of medicine. I think they are talking about the counseling mechanism. That's not mutually exclusive. A lot of problems that the proposition have described can be mitigated by regular professional counseling, which is status quo, and that's not relevant to prescription of medicine. Secondly, why counseling is okay for minors to go without parental consent? That's because disproportionate physical side effect is non-existent. That's what leader of opposition and deputy leader of opposition have explained. You should have listened to it. Based on which, I would like to answer 3 questions in this debate. First of all, I'm happy to engage with the minor scenarios that proposition has described in this debate. Secondly, how should we deal with the side effects and the harm to minors? Thirdly, the boundary of parental rights. So moving on to the first criterion of this debate, the minor scenario, very rare case scenario that the proposition have presented in this debate. I'm happy to engage with the Prime Minister first. 4 levels of rebuttals. Number one, the first logic is that the parents are sometimes older generation, they have bad images about mental instability. That's very unrealistic characterization. Parents oftentimes witness their children suffering every day, and they have natural incentive to at least take them into hospital. Whether to use medicine or not is a different debate, but at least they take medicines. Or sometimes media and politicians emphasize importance of medical health these days. So they have a lot of opportunity to be exposed to countervailing discourse right now. So that kind of a characterization of extreme parents is very limited in the status quo. Secondly, the second logic is the relation with parents is the cause of the problem. So the children can't ask parents, and even if they visit doctors, because of the fear of reporting it to the parents, sometimes children hesitate to visit doctors. But you can ask a school counselor or teachers first. It's not like no conversation with legitimate adults happens right now. The process is like this. First, you might talk to school counselors or teachers. Then those school counselors, you can have several times discussion and counseling. Then if the situation is diagnosed as a wrong, then the schools or counselors have incentive to chat with the parents. Then at the final stage, the prescription of medicine is discussed. So it's not like the radical process that the proposition might imagine. We can slower the process of engagement with involving a lot of adults in our current system. Thirdly, the benefit the Prime Minister explained is that we can access professional counseling. It's not relevant to the motion. We are talking about prescription of medicine. Why use of tranquilizer and medicine is critical, and that's the burden that the proposition has insufficiently explained in this debate. Number 4, if they are talking about radical parents, if parents find out that the teenagers or their children secretly go to hospital, the situation will be worse because parents will be all the less cooperative to give instruction and counseling inside their house. We need slow and gradual discussion process and transparent discussion process with school counselor, teachers, and parents when it comes to dealing with long-term curing process of mental disease. And this kind of process will be impossible because of the halation and conflicts that happens on the proposition model. The Deputy Prime Minister elaborated 3 case studies, so I will give 3 responses back. 1, in case of eating disorder, in order to cure eating disorder, long time counseling process, long curing process is necessary, like an eating habit improvement or the physical activity inside the house. We need to enlighten parents about food habit. This kind of cooperation will be impossible when the minor just go to visit hospitals without telling parents about it. Under our model, on contrary, we can dispatch medical personnel to give proper instruction to parents. That's happening inside like countries like Australia and the United States to deal with the obesity problem. We are happy to make parents get involved in this kind of improvement of food habit and eating disorder habit. Second, about depression and anxiety, like sexual identity crisis. Some conservative parents are not relevant, are not like motivated to talk to their kids about sexual identity. It's not the matter of medicine. It's more about the counseling mechanism is necessary, which is available even in the status quo. When you talk about like transgender surgery in an operation, then we believe judgment of parents are necessary, considering the disproportionate side effects. So that case study is not relevant to the debate. Finally, like PTSD or ADHD, you are sometimes ashamed to share your experience with your parents. If you don't talk about it with your parents, the situation will be worse because proper private counseling and curing process inside the house is necessary and should be given at home. Exactly what parents should know. That PTSD or ADHD is exactly what parents should know in order to minimize exacerbation. Embracing that kind of problem alone is pretty dangerous. Moving on to the second issue is about harm to children. So the leader of opposition and deputy prime minister talk about the overdose and addictions and multiple layers of harms. We've got a response from proposition that professionals are able to mitigate the problems. No, 3 rebuttals. 1, without parental involvement, the doctors can't access full medical information like allergies or history or records of surgery in the past. Accurate amount of tranquilizer is hard to determine when you don't access the full medical information about the children. Secondly, second opinion. The parents have full knowledge about children's symptoms and harbinger, but it's difficult for one psychological doctor to completely judge the harbinger. Sometimes the physical disease is the cause of the problem, not the mental problem. So if children go along, it's hard for them to access second opinion. They don't have even the conception of second opinion in the first place. Thirdly, even professional doctors have a perverse incentive to exploit kids and teenagers. They want to sell many drugs in order to maximize their profit. They want money, or they can sexually harass mentally unstable children. That really happens very frequently. It's hard to identify and find the incident because it happens inside a closed door. It's hard to make a prosecution about it. That is why attendance of parents is pretty necessary. About the legal framework, people can randomly access websites and get it. 1, we can regulate it. We can shut down websites which sells drugs without license. 2, it's not mutually exclusive. Even under the proposition model, teens who don't want to talk about those things with adults might get it anywhere from the dubious platform. You can't do anything about it with those kids. Moving on to the final issues about the boundary of parental rights. 3 responses. 1, the Prime Minister said the children own their own body. They have invested in it. No, when the side effect is disproportionate and when the individuals are not aware of the long-term implication, we compromise bodily autonomy of parents. We don't allow alcohol, smoking, sex, and labor, and those are the analogies. Second of all, parents do not have the same subjective experience. No, parents do share common interests. That is why even under the civil law, parents make compensation for the children's violence against other classmates. They share the custody. Reciprocally, they have a right to make a decision about their children's behavior. Finally, age is arbitrary. Yes, we believe age is arbitrary, but as a tendency, specific demographic groups have a propensity to act in a certain way. That is why voting age, contract, driver's license, juvenile laws are determined according to age. We are happy to oppose. Thank you.
すいません、メイジさんすいません。スピーチがスタートされてなかったせいでですね、側がポイずっと立ってたんですけど、取ることができなかったので、最後にポイだけ取っていただいて、それに応答だけ、
すいません、すいません。
いただいてもいいですか？
どうぞ。はい。
Okay, so depression is literally chemicals in your brain that requires medicine. On our side, at least kids can go to a professional rather than going online or resorting to self-harm when they have no alternative.
I don't think that's a mutually exclusive benefit. Even on our side of the house, people or children and scholars can access some form of medical counseling provided by school that can mitigate that sort of problems. We are happy to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, ladies and gentlemen. The problem of the opposition bench was that there were many new arguments being made, as well as too many false dichotomies being presented. So I'm going to resolve this and tell you why government won. I'm going to talk about three things. About the mutual non-exclusivity, about for the alternatives on their side of the house. Secondly, what happens to the kids. Lastly, can kids decide and not the parents? Firstly, about the non-mutually exclusive alternatives from their side of the house. They have given us that on their side of the house, parents will be educated, like states will ask parents to be supportive to the kids, look after the kids, care about the kids and all that kind of things. They will have said that counselors would act as a cushion and all that kind of things. We agree with that, and we think that is best. We do take that into account. But the thing is, ladies and gentlemen, even though most parents will be supportive, we think that the kids who are likely to be depressed, even in that circumstances, and can't ask for parents to accompany to the doctors, are the ones who are born under the parents who are the most unsupportive. People who have the least understanding towards sexual diversity or understanding towards mental problems. These people who sit and watch TV together and make all kinds of rude things about body shamings and all that kind of things. Makes the kids, it's parents who makes the kid feel as if you can't consult with your parents, so you have to go alone. Go alone. The burden on the opposition bench, therefore, becomes that even in cases of the most supportive parents, why is consent from these parents a requirement? They have told us two things. Firstly, it was about how there is a lot of harms. Let's look about one. What about addiction? These pills are caused by addiction. You're talking about legal doctors who give out pills as necessary. According, they have a regulation. They do judge how many pills is adequate per visit. So that's not hard. That doesn't really change. Again, there is a black market. People get it from their friends as well. Again, this is might cause addiction on their side of the house as well. Secondly, they have told us that doctors will be persuaded by emotional speaking of the children. Again, these are professional people. But the thing is, ladies and gentlemen, we don't necessarily think that doctors who face emotional bowing all the time would drop into these cases. More importantly, they have told us how proper family care cannot be obtained for these kids under our side of the house. But again, this is a wrong dichotomy. Because the comparison here is that it's not the real comparison here is about a kid getting no support from the parents because the parents are the simple assholes and they don't get pills as well. The comparison on our side of the house is that you may well not get any support from parents, but you do get the pills. And pills are enough to react chemically into your brain and make you able to breathe, make you calm down and study and escape from the parent household if they wish. Also, they have told us a new argument about what happens if parents find out. What happens when parents find out when you're getting secretly pills from your friends or from random people you meet on the internet? Again, not mutually exclusive. Next thing they have told us about harassment by doctors. One, it's unlikely, we're talking professionals, but again, you get harassed by a pedophile, you randomly meet on the internet, it doesn't really change. But lastly, they gave us that bad doctors give you allergic pills. if we think that allergic tests are a requirement for doctors, we can do that on our side of the house as well. It's within the principle, and we can do that. The only plausible response we heard from all these kinds of things was that, well, the black market can be regulated without necessarily showing how ineffective it is. We specifically told you about how pills for contraception is being shared through the illegal market between friends, and that is a problem already in liberal democracies. But lastly, can the kid decide? We've told you about how this is not within the scope of parental rights because parents don't necessarily know the best about the kids. The funny thing they have told us was that parents know about MRIs and how they function. You don't need that in order to get a pill from a psychiatrist. But we think that the situation of you living right now at school and your parents living at school 30 years ago is very, very different. But moreover, we tell you that your harms in your mind is very invisible, and you are ultimately a very different person for your parents. We think when it comes to a medical decision about how you cure your own body, we think that is up to you. We do propose.